Welcome back to the Horror Shack. As you settle in for a night of chilling tales, you ever have one of those feelings where you're sure you're alone, but something just feels off? Like there's something just out of view, something you can't quite see, but you know it's there. I don't mean that in a dramatic, spooky way. I'm talking about the kind of feeling that makes the hair on your arm stand up for no good reason. The way you catch yourself looking over your shoulder in an empty room. That's the feeling I had that whole summer I spent at my grandmother's house. And it only got worse tonight. We'll explore a true story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now, let's get comfy. My grandmother's place was, well, old. It had all those quirks that you might expect in an old house. Creaky floors, doors that never quite closed, the occasional flickering light. But this house, in particular, felt almost like it was suspended in time. Like every piece of furniture, every scratch on the wall, was exactly the same as it had been for the last 50 years. Nothing ever changed. You'd look around and think, when was the last time anyone even used this room? And most of the time, the answer was decades ago. I was there because my parents thought it would be good for me to get away from the city for the summer. They figured I could help my grandmother with some chores around the house, spend some time outdoors, maybe even unplug for a while. And yeah, part of me thought it would be a nice break too. But as soon as I got there, I could tell this was going to be one of those long, dragging summers. You know what I mean? Where the days just seemed to stretch on forever. The town was small, and there wasn't really much to do besides walking down the same few blocks, seeing the same few people. I quickly found myself getting bored out of my mind, especially in the evenings. That's how I ended up exploring the attic. I was looking for something, anything, to pass the time. I knew it would be dusty and cluttered with a bunch of stuff my grandmother had no use for, but just couldn't bring herself to throw away. I didn't expect to find anything particularly interesting, but I was desperate. I wasn't prepared for just how cluttered that attic actually was. Boxes stacked upon boxes, old lamps, worn-out blankets, you name it. I remember thinking, how much stuff can one person really have? It was like walking through a maze made of old memories. And that's when I found it, the doll. It was sitting there, almost buried under a stack of old books and a torn quilt. I wouldn't have noticed it if it hadn't been for the glint of its glassy eyes catching the light as I moved past. There was something about it that stopped me in my tracks. You know how sometimes, when you're looking at something, you feel like it's looking right back at you? That's how it felt with this doll. Its face was strange, not scary, not exactly, but it had this look like it was both delicate and lifeless at the same time. Porcelain skin, faded pink lips, and those dark, unblinking eyes. It looked like the kind of doll that was expensive once, but time hadn't been kind to it. There were tiny cracks around its mouth, and its hair was matted and stiff, like it hadn't been touched in years. Now, I'll admit, I'm not exactly someone who collects creepy old dolls or anything like that, but something about this one, I don't know, it felt like I was meant to find it, like it was waiting for me. I remember feeling a weird mix of curiosity and dread, and yet I picked it up anyway. And yeah, I felt a little weird about it, but I figured it was just a doll, right? What harm could it do? I brought it down to my room, setting it on a small shelf by the window. For the first couple of days, the doll just sat there. I didn't think much of it, honestly. It was just one of those things I'd glance at every now and then, but something about it always felt off. I'd catch myself staring at it for no real reason, like I was expecting it to do something. It's strange. I mean, it's a doll, right? It's supposed to just sit there. And yet, whenever I looked away, I'd get this feeling that its eyes were still on me. One night it started raining. Not just a light drizzle, but one of those heavy, relentless downpours that seemed to come out of nowhere. I lay in bed, listening to the rain hammering against the window, the sound oddly comforting. And as I was drifting off, I swear I heard a faint, almost scratching noise. It was soft, barely there, but distinct enough to pull me out of my half-sleep. I sat up, looking around the room, and there it was. The doll was still on the shelf, right where I'd left it, but something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like it was closer somehow. I shook my head, feeling silly, and settled back into bed. It was probably just my imagination, right? I told myself that the sound had just been the rain, maybe a branch tapping against the house. Nothing to worry about. But the next morning, when I woke up, the doll was on my dresser. I remember just staring at it, trying to make sense of how it could have moved. I was certain I'd left it on the shelf the night before, but there it was, sitting neatly on the edge of the dresser, facing my bed. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I must have moved it and forgotten. Maybe I'd gotten up in the middle of the night or something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I hadn't touched it. Still, I put it back on the shelf and tried to ignore it. But the next night, the rain came again. And once again, I heard that scratching noise. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just the storm. But the sound kept going, soft but steady, like something was moving across the floor. I forced myself to stay still, gripping the blankets, not daring to look around. I don't know how long I lay there listening to that faint scratching, but eventually it stopped, and somehow I managed to fall asleep. The following morning, the doll was even closer, this time right at the foot of my bed. I stared at it, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I hadn't moved it. I knew I hadn't. And yet, there it was, as if it had just gotten up and walked across the room during the night. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was definitely wrong with this doll. But what was I supposed to do? It's just a doll, right? It's not like it could actually move on its own, right? That night, I decided to put it back in the attic. I wasn't about to let a doll freak me out in my own room. I wrapped it in an old towel, carried it up to the attic, and shoved it back in the box where I'd found it. I shut the box, making sure it was tightly closed, and left it there. For the rest of the day, I tried to distract myself, doing anything I could to keep my mind off that doll. I told myself it was over, that I'd just let my imagination get the better of me. But as night fell, the rain returned, heavier than ever. I lay in bed, feeling strangely tense. I kept telling myself that the doll was back in the attic, boxed up and out of sight. But that didn't stop the unease creeping over me. Every creak, every little noise made me jump. And then, the scratching started again. My heart practically stopped. The scratching sound was louder this time, insistent and steady, like something was purposefully moving across the floor above me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I'd left the doll in the attic. There was no way it could have moved on its own. But as I lay there, the noise seemed to get closer, as if it was coming down the attic stairs, one step at a time. I tried to tell myself it was just the old house settling, or maybe an animal that had found its way in somehow. But that didn't make sense. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. I pulled the covers up, gripping them so tightly my knuckles hurt, and squeezed my eyes shut. I just needed to sleep. I'd wake up in the morning, and everything would be fine, right? I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Light was streaming through the window, and the rain had finally stopped. For a moment, I felt relief. Whatever had happened last night, it was over now. But when I looked across the room, I froze. The doll was sitting on my dresser again. I couldn't breathe. I was sure I'd left it in the attic, packed away in that old box. But there it was, its unblinking eyes staring straight at me, as if it had been waiting for me to wake up. And this time, I could swear its expression had changed. The slight, eerie smile on its face seemed wider, more pronounced and somehow mocking. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to get rid of it. I grabbed the doll, practically running downstairs, and threw it into the garbage bin outside. I made sure it was buried under layers of trash, so there was no way it could somehow come back. I felt a strange sense of relief as I walked back inside, as if I'd finally taken control. That night, it rained again. The scratching sound didn't come back, and I actually managed to fall asleep peacefully, convinced that the doll was finally out of my life. But the next morning, I woke up to something even worse. It was there again, sitting on my dresser, exactly where I'd found it before. The same twisted grin, the same unblinking stare. And this time, it was holding a scrap of damp, muddy paper. I picked it up, hands shaking, and saw 3 words scrawled across it in smeared ink. "You can't hide." I felt a chill like ice run through me. My stomach twisted, and I could feel every hair on the back of my neck standing up. I backed away from the dresser, clutching the note in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. None of this was possible, but the doll was right there, somehow back in my room, with that smug little grin on its face. I felt like I was losing my mind. I had to do something drastic. I couldn't just keep ignoring it, and clearly throwing it in the trash hadn't worked. So I decided to burn it. I took it outside to the old fire pit in the backyard, clutching a box of matches with trembling hands. I set the doll in the center, piled some dried leaves and bits of wood around it, and struck a match. As the flames caught, I could feel a surge of relief. This was it. This had to be the end. I watched the fire grow, the flames licking around the doll's porcelain face, the eyes starting to blacken. I stood there until I was sure it had been reduced to ashes, waiting for every trace of it to disappear. Only then did I turn around and head back inside, feeling lighter than I had in days. That night, I slept better than I had in a long time. No scratching sounds, no rain tapping on the window. I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed, almost forgetting the fear that had gripped me for days. It was over, but when I walked back into my room, my heart nearly stopped. The doll was there, sitting on my bed. It looked different this time. Its once pristine porcelain was cracked, blackened in spots, and the paint on its face was smudged and warped. And yet, those eyes were the same, staring at me with that same mocking expression. I backed out of the room, heart pounding, barely able to process what I was seeing. In a panic, I called my friend, someone I'd known for years, and who I figured would at least listen to me, even if this whole thing sounded insane. I explained everything, every little detail, from finding it in the attic to the rain and the note. I could hear the disbelief in his voice, but he could tell I was genuinely freaked out. He offered to come over and help me get rid of it once and for all. That night, he came by, and we agreed to bury the doll. We took it far, far from the house, out to a wooded area at the edge of town. The entire time, I felt like it was staring at me, its expression even angrier now, its cracked face twisted into something that almost looked alive. We dug a deep hole, tossed the doll in, and filled it with dirt. I even stomped on the ground to pack it down. There was no way it was coming back this time. I felt a little better as we drove back. My friend tried to lighten the mood, telling me I'd probably just let my imagination run wild, but I wasn't convinced. All I knew was that I couldn't deal with this anymore. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the soft, scratching sound. I didn't move, barely breathing, listening as it grew louder and louder, creeping closer and closer. I wanted to get up, to run, but fear kept me frozen in place. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the scratching stopped. I dared to look around the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, but there was nothing. I lay back down, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was over, that I was finally safe. But the next morning, when I opened my eyes, I found the doll lying on the pillow right next to me. Its face was inches from mine, its glassy eyes locked onto me, and its mouth twisted into a smile that seemed almost alive. In its tiny, cracked hands, it held another piece of damp, muddy paper. This time, The note read, "You belong to me." My mind went blank. I wanted to scream, to throw the doll across the room, to do anything to break the spell it seemed to have over me. But I was paralyzed, my gaze locked on its twisted smile and lifeless eyes that somehow seemed more alive than ever. The words on the note echoed in my head. "You belong to me." It was like a warning, or maybe a promise. I finally managed to force myself out of bed, never taking my eyes off the doll. I backed out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and ran downstairs. My grandmother was in the kitchen, humming to herself, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding upstairs. I didn't know how to explain any of this to her. How could I? She'd think I was crazy, or worse, just messing around. But I had to say something. So I told her about the doll, how I'd found it in the attic, how it kept appearing in my room, how I tried to throw it away, burn it, bury it. I left out the part about the notes. That felt too ridiculous even to mention. She listened, her expression slowly changing from amusement to something more serious. When I was done, she looked at me with a strange, unreadable expression. After a long pause, she said, "That doll belonged to my sister." That caught me off guard. My grandmother's sister had passed away long before I was born. I'd only heard a few stories about her. She died young, under strange circumstances. No one ever talked about the details. But before I could ask anything else, my grandmother shook her head, as if shaking off a bad memory. She loved that doll, she said quietly. Took it with her everywhere, even insisted on sleeping with it every night. But she hesitated, looking down. One night, she started having nightmares. Terrible ones. She would wake up screaming, saying the doll was trying to hurt her. My parents thought she was just a frightened little girl with an overactive imagination. But her voice trailed off, and she stared into her coffee cup as if lost in thought. But what? I pressed, my heart pounding. She died not long after. In her sleep, my parents found her with the doll in her arms. And the strangest thing was, her face looked scared. Terrified even, like she'd seen something that no one else could. A shiver ran down my spine. My grandmother's story felt like the missing piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I asked her why she kept the doll all these years, and she just shrugged, looking away. Maybe I thought it was just a silly story. Or maybe I didn't want to believe it. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too scared to close my eyes. I'd left the doll in my room, on the floor where I'd found it that morning, but now I felt its presence even through the walls. Every creak, every groan of the house made me flinch, my imagination running wild. I didn't want to check if it had moved closer. I didn't want to know where it was. But I also knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I did. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly pushing the door open. My room was dark, the shadows stretching long and menacing across the walls. I scanned the floor, half expecting the doll to be right there, waiting. But it wasn't. The spot where I'd left it was empty. My pulse quickened. I swung the flashlight beam around the room, my breath catching in my throat. And there it was, sitting on my pillow, right in the spot where my head would be. The note I'd found that morning was still in its hand, and its eyes were fixed on me, that awful grin even wider, like it was mocking my fear. I took a step back, my mind racing. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't burn it, couldn't bury it, couldn't leave it anywhere it wouldn't find its way back from. It was as if it had claimed me, bound to me in some twisted, unbreakable way. I backed out of the room, closing the door again, as if that could somehow keep it contained. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough. It would always find a way back. I could feel it waiting, biding its time. And even now, every time it rains, I still hear the scratching. Days went by, and I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I'd stay out of the house as much as possible, keeping busy and trying not to think about that doll waiting for me in my room. But no matter where I went, no matter how many distractions I found, the feeling of those dark, unblinking eyes was always there, lingering like a shadow. Then one night, the rain started again, and with it, that familiar tapping on the window. I stayed downstairs as long as I could, listening to the storm and wondering if I could just sleep on the couch, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, I forced myself to go back up to my room, praying that somehow the doll would be gone. As I pushed open the door, I saw it immediately. It was no longer on my pillow, but sitting in the chair by my desk, its gaze directly on the door, as if it had been waiting for me. And clutched in its tiny, porcelain hand was yet another note, folded neatly, the paper stained slightly at the edges as if it had been there for years. I hesitated, but something compelled me to read it. With a shaky hand, I reached out and pulled the note from its grasp. The message was different this time. It was longer, almost like it was meant to be a warning. You ignored me once. You left me behind. I waited for you. Now, I'm here to stay. A chill ran through me. The words felt personal, like they were meant specifically for me, as if the doll itself was speaking to me. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just some object. It was something far worse, something that wanted me to know it wasn't going to leave until I did something about it. I thought about throwing it away again, but each attempt to get rid of it had failed. The more I tried to escape, the closer it seemed to get, like it was tightening its grip. My mind raced, trying to come up with a solution. Maybe I could lock it in a box, seal it somewhere it couldn't escape. Or perhaps I needed to confront it somehow, to understand what it wanted, why it had come back to me. That night, I barely slept, lying awake in bed and watching the doll from across the room, waiting for any sign of movement. The hours dragged by, the rain pounding harder and harder against the window, filling the room with a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to match the beat of my racing heart. When dawn finally broke, I had a plan. I didn't know if it would work, but I was out of options. I gathered my things, packed a small bag, and took the doll with me. If it wanted me, then I would be the one to take it somewhere far away, where it couldn't hurt anyone else, where it could stay locked away forever. I drove for hours, going as far from my grandmother's house as I could. I found an old, abandoned shed near the edge of town, a place no one would go looking. It felt remote, isolated, the perfect spot for something I wanted to leave behind for good. With trembling hands, I placed the doll inside, locking the door and securing it with chains I'd bought along the way. I left it there, standing alone in the darkness, its eyes fixed on me one last time before I shut the door and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. I returned to my grandmother's house, exhausted but relieved, hoping that I'd finally broken whatever strange connection I had with that doll. But then, that night, as the rain started again, I heard it, the faintest, most familiar sound, a tapping, just like before, on my window. And when I looked, there it was, sitting on my windowsill, its grin wider than ever. I froze, my heart dropped, and I could barely breathe as I stared at it, just sitting there outside the window. Somehow, against all logic and reason, it had found its way back to me. Its porcelain face was pressed against the glass, and I could almost swear I saw a smirk, a twisted, satisfied expression that hadn't been there before. For a long time, I just stood there, caught in a kind of horrified trance. I couldn't bring myself to move closer, but I couldn't look away either. My mind raced, filled with questions and disbelief. Had someone brought it back, or was it actually moving on its own? I shook my head, trying to push the thought out. There had to be a logical explanation. Gathering what little courage I had left, I slowly walked over to the window, peering at it through the rain-streaked glass. Its eyes met mine, cold and unyielding, and I felt an intense chill run down my spine, like it was staring straight into me. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn away, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. After what felt like an eternity, I reached out, unlocked the window, and opened it just a crack, enough to push the doll out and let it fall to the ground below. I slammed the window shut and backed away, hoping that would somehow be enough to break whatever hold it had on me. That night, I barely slept, my eyes darting to the window every few minutes, expecting to see it there, staring back at me. But the hours passed, and it never returned. The next morning, I went outside to check. My heart was pounding as I approached the spot where I tossed it, but when I got there, the doll was gone. I looked around, scouring every inch of the yard, but it had simply vanished. I should have been relieved, but instead, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Somehow, deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. For the next few nights, everything was quiet. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the doll had finally left me alone. But then, on the fifth night, just as I was starting to relax, the rain returned. The soft tapping began again, like a haunting lullaby that filled the room, and I felt that same familiar chill. I glanced toward the window, terrified of what I might see, and sure enough, there it was. The doll was sitting inside my room this time, right at the foot of my bed, its face tilted slightly, those dark eyes staring up at me with an expression that seemed almost pleased. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't escape, a cycle I couldn't break. Every time I tried to get rid of it, it came back, each time getting closer, more persistent, more determined. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. Desperate, I decided to do something I hadn't tried before. I reached out to a local historian, someone who specialized in antiques and paranormal artifacts. I explained as best as I could without sounding completely unhinged about the doll, the attic, and everything that had happened since I found it. The historian listened patiently, and after a long pause, they said something that sent shivers through me. They told me that dolls like these were often made as vessels, a way to preserve the spirit or essence of someone who had passed. If the doll had returned to me, it likely meant that there was unfinished business, something or someone it was bound to, something it wanted from me. But what does it want? I asked, feeling a growing sense of unease. The historian sighed. It's hard to say. Spirits can be restless for many reasons: grief, anger, attachment. But one thing's for sure. Until you figure out what it wants, it won't leave you alone. That night, as the rain drummed against the windows once again, I sat alone in my room, the doll placed on the chair across from me. I looked into its eyes, searching for any clue, any hint of what it wanted. And then, as if in response, I noticed a small, barely visible detail on its face, a single crack, running down from the corner of its mouth, like a tear frozen in porcelain. It was then that I realized this wasn't just a doll. It was a memory, a remnant of someone who had been left behind. I sat there, the room thick with silence except for the rain outside. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. Who was this doll tied to? And what unfinished business could it possibly have? The historian's words echoed in my head. Until you figure out what it wants, it won't leave you alone. But how was I supposed to figure that out? It's not like the doll could just tell me. I remember my grandmother telling me stories about her own childhood in this house. Stories about relatives I'd never met. People whose names had faded from memory, just like the doll in the attic. Maybe I thought this doll had once belonged to someone in our family, someone who had lived here long before I was born. With a shaky breath, I got up and went to find my grandmother. She was sitting in her cozy corner of the living room, knitting, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows that felt strangely comforting after the tension in my room. "Grandma," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know anything about the old doll in the attic? The one with the porcelain face?" She looked up, her eyes widening slightly. "The doll, she repeated, a bit of surprise in her tone. "Oh, I thought that thing was long gone. That belonged to your Aunt Margaret." Aunt Margaret? The name was unfamiliar, like a half-remembered story I'd heard once, but couldn't quite place. "Yes, my sister," she said, her voice turning soft with nostalgia. "She was a bit older than me and passed away when she was young. She loved that doll, carried it everywhere. After she died, my parents put it up in the attic. They couldn't bear to look at it. My heart pounded. Could that be it? Could this doll somehow be connected to Aunt Margaret's spirit? I felt a strange mix of relief and dread, like I was finally uncovering the truth, but also opening a door I wasn't sure I wanted open. Did she have any unfinished business? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My grandmother hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the rain-speckled window. She was always a bit different, you know. Quiet, thoughtful. She loved this house, and she had this strange habit of saying she'd never leave. I never thought much of it as a kid, but now, I don't know. She looked back at me, her eyes serious. I think maybe she's still here in some way. That night, I returned to my room with a renewed sense of determination. If Aunt Margaret was connected to this doll, maybe I could finally put her spirit to rest. I sat down across from the doll again, watching it carefully, looking for any sign, any flicker of movement or expression. And then, almost instinctively, I began to speak. I told her I was sorry she'd been left alone all these years, that I understood now. I told her she didn't need to stay, that it was okay to let go, that she could finally rest. The rain seemed to soften, the tapping against the window growing gentle, almost soothing. And then, just as I finished, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm fill the room, a peace I hadn't felt since I'd first found the doll. I put it back in the attic that night, in the same tattered box where I'd found it. And from that day on, I never saw it again. The rain would come, tapping against the windows as it always did, but the doll stayed put. It was as if Aunt Margaret had finally found the peace she'd been searching for. To this day, I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but sometimes, late at night, when the rain is heavy, I swear I can still feel a presence in the house, gentle and quiet, like someone watching over me. And maybe, just maybe, that's my Aunt Margaret, keeping her silent promise that she'd never really leave. As the days passed, life returned to normal. The summer sun chased away the rain, and I settled into a routine at my grandmother's house. I often thought about the doll and Aunt Margaret, but I was relieved to have put that unsettling chapter behind me. Yet, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't fully completed my connection with her. Maybe it was just the lingering sense of unfinished business, a thread left dangling that I didn't know how to tie up. One evening, while flipping through an old photo album in the living room, I came across a picture of Aunt Margaret. She was a young girl, smiling brightly, holding that very same doll. Her hair was pulled back in neat braids, and there was a twinkle in her eye that felt strangely familiar. I stared at the photo, a sense of recognition washing over me as I traced her features with my finger. It was like looking into a mirror, seeing the echoes of my own childhood reflected back at me. She was so happy with that doll, my grandmother said, glancing at the picture over my shoulder. Always playing pretend, imagining all sorts of adventures. I looked up at her, a question burning in my mind. Do you think she ever wanted to go anywhere? Do you think she wanted to be free? My grandmother sighed, her gaze distant. I think she wanted to be loved. She always felt a little out of place, like she didn't belong. Maybe that's why she attached herself to that doll. It was her friend when no one else was. That struck a chord within me. I wondered if Aunt Margaret had felt lonely in her own home, just as I sometimes did. I realized that perhaps I had misjudged the doll and the spirit it carried. Maybe it wasn't about haunting me. It was about seeking connection, longing for the love it had once known. As the last few weeks of summer slipped away, the skies began to darken again. The rain returned, tapping against the windows with an urgency that felt familiar. I tried to shake off the unease that accompanied it, but that night, I found myself restless in bed. Memories of the doll and my conversations with Aunt Margaret swirled in my mind. Suddenly, I had an idea. What if I could do something for her, something that would honor her memory and give her the love she had craved? I decided to write her a letter, pouring out my thoughts and feelings, acknowledging her presence and the bond we had shared, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. I crept downstairs to the living room, the rain tapping a steady rhythm on the roof. With a piece of paper and a pen in hand, I wrote, "Dear Aunt Margaret, I'm sorry for not understanding you before. I realize now how lonely you must have felt, how much you needed someone to love you. You were never truly forgotten. I promise you that. I'll always remember you, and I hope you find peace. You are loved, and you don't have to stay here anymore. It's okay to let go." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. As I sealed it, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. It was a simple gesture, but somehow it felt significant. I decided I would leave it with the doll in the attic, a final message of love and understanding. The next day, I climbed up to the attic once more, the air heavy with the scent of dust and memories. The doll was still there, untouched in its tattered box. As I placed the letter beside it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a promise, one that would finally give Aunt Margaret the closure she needed. That night, as the rain poured outside, I fell into a deep sleep, cradled by a sense of calm. I dreamed of a little girl with braids, laughing and playing in a sunlit field. She turned to me, her eyes sparkling, and I knew in that moment that she was free to chase whatever dreams lay ahead. When I woke up, the rain had stopped. I blinked at the sunlight filtering through my bedroom window, and for the first time in weeks, I felt an overwhelming sense of hope. I climbed out of bed and made my way to the attic to check on the doll. But to my surprise, the box was empty. The doll was gone. My heart raced. Has someone taken it? Did it vanish on its own? I searched every corner of the attic and every room in the house, but it was nowhere to be found. I hesitated, then headed back to my grandmother. "Grandma, did you move the doll?" She looked puzzled. "What doll?" "The one you found in the attic. I thought you put it away." I felt a chill creep down my spine. "It's gone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother frowned. "That's odd. Maybe it was just time to go. Time to go." The words echoed in my mind, bringing both fear and relief. I couldn't help but wonder if Aunt Margaret had finally found the peace she so desperately sought, leaving behind the doll that had held her memories. I looked out the window at the now clear sky, a feeling of bittersweet sadness washing over me. The summer was drawing to a close, but I felt a strange comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone. Even if Aunt Margaret was gone, she had left her mark on me, a gentle reminder to cherish love and connection. As I settled into my last few days at my grandmother's house, I felt an undeniable change in the atmosphere. The shadows seemed less intimidating, and the silence that once felt heavy was now laced with warmth. I began to see the house in a new light, a place filled with stories, memories, and perhaps a touch of magic. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of the doll faded, replaced by the bright moments of summer and the comforting embrace of my grandmother's home. I spent my time exploring the nearby woods, swimming in the lake, and listening to my grandmother's stories of her youth. The oppressive weight of the doll's presence had lifted, and I felt lighter, as if a burden had been released. However, as summer slipped into fall, the leaves turning golden and the air growing crisp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow that would vanish the moment I turned my head. I often found myself glancing toward the attic, half expecting to see the doll sitting there, waiting for me to acknowledge it once more. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the landscape, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The trees, adorned in vibrant hues of red and orange, whispered with the wind, and I felt at peace. It was during this stroll that I stumbled upon a small clearing I had never seen before. At the center stood a solitary, twisted tree, its branches reaching out like bony fingers. Curiosity piqued, I approached the tree. Beneath it lay a pile of rocks, unevenly stacked, almost as if they were a makeshift shrine. I knelt down to inspect it, brushing away the leaves and dirt. At the very bottom, I uncovered a small, dusty journal bound in leather. The cover was cracked, but it felt strangely warm in my hands, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I opened the journal carefully, revealing yellowed pages filled with delicate handwriting. The entries seemed to belong to a young girl, perhaps Aunt Margaret herself. She wrote about her days spent playing with her doll, her dreams of adventure, and her longing for a friend who would understand her. Each word resonated with emotion, a reflection of the loneliness I had sensed before. One entry caught my eye. It described a secret game she and her doll would play, a game of hide and seek, where the doll would come to life and find her in the dark corners of the house. The last line sent a chill down my spine. Sometimes, when it rains, the doll whispers my name and asks me to join her in the dark. I closed the journal, my heart racing. Could it be that the doll had been trying to reach out to me all along? Had Aunt Margaret's spirit truly lingered, seeking companionship in her own special way? That night, the rain returned. The tapping against the windows was a familiar sound, one that had once brought me dread, but now felt oddly comforting. As I lay in bed, clutching the journal, I found myself thinking about Aunt Margaret and her doll. I felt a strange sense of connection with her, as if we were kindred spirits bound by the same loneliness. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. It was as if the wind was carrying a message, a soft call echoing through the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was a name, the unmistakable sound of Margaret. My heart raced as I sat up, glancing around the room. The air felt charged, electric with energy. I slipped out of bed, drawn to the attic once more, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I ascended, and the moment I reached the top, I was engulfed in darkness. I flicked the light switch, illuminating the attic with a dim glow. My eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the doll. To my surprise, the box where I had left it was wide open, empty once more. Panic bubbled within me, and I called out, "Aunt Margaret." The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken words, as if the walls themselves were listening. I could almost feel her presence wrapping around me, urging me to understand. I stepped further into the attic, the shadows dancing on the walls, and I felt compelled to search through the clutter once more. That's when I spotted it, a glimmer beneath a pile of old clothes in the corner. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. As I moved the garments aside, I uncovered the doll, sitting eerily still, a soft glow emanating from its porcelain skin. I could hardly believe my eyes. I reached for it, and as soon as my fingers touched the cold porcelain, I felt a rush of warmth flood through me, an energy that tingled at my fingertips. In that instant, it was as if the doll transformed, no longer a mere object, but a vessel filled with memories, emotions, and untold stories. "Thank you for finding me," a voice echoed in my mind, clear as day. It was gentle, sweet, and oh so familiar. My breath caught in my throat. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Yes," the voice replied, filling the attic with an enchanting melody. "You listened. You understood." Tears welled in my eyes as I cradled the doll in my hands, feeling the weight of history behind it. "I'm sorry I didn't realize sooner." I didn't know how lonely you were. The air shimmered, and I could see visions playing out in front of me. Margaret and her doll dancing in the sunlight. The two of them whispering secrets, laughing in their own world. It was beautiful, a life filled with joy, yet tinged with sadness. "Will you play with me?" the voice asked, the warmth enveloping me like a hug. "I don't want to be alone anymore." I closed my eyes, feeling the connection deepen, and nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll play with you." In that moment, I understood that the bond we shared went beyond mere companionship. It was a friendship built on empathy, a longing to be understood. As the rain poured down outside, I felt the walls of the attic fade away, and I was transported to a place where time stood still, where the echoes of laughter filled the air, and where loneliness could never reach us again. As I cradled the doll in my hands, the warmth intensified, and I felt myself being drawn into a vivid, dreamlike state. The attic around me began to dissolve, replaced by a sunlit meadow filled with wildflowers swaying in a gentle breeze. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, and for the first time, I felt a deep sense of belonging. Margaret appeared before me, her spirit shimmering like the sun reflecting on water. She was dressed in a simple white dress, her hair falling softly around her shoulders. The doll in my hands transformed, its porcelain becoming a part of this ethereal vision. It felt as if Margaret's spirit had infused the doll with life, allowing us to bridge the gap between the living and the departed. "Thank you for playing with me," she said, her voice light and cheerful. "You have no idea how long I've waited for someone like you." I blinked, still trying to process the incredible shift in reality. "How is this possible?" I asked, the words spilling from my lips. "You were just a doll? I thought you were just a toy." Margaret giggled, a sound that rang like a bell. "I'm more than just a doll. I was made to be a friend, but over time, I lost my way." People forget the magic of childhood and the importance of companionship. When you found me, you reignited that magic. I looked around at the vibrant meadow, feeling a mixture of joy and sadness. "But what about the loneliness you felt? The doll moving in my room, was that you?" "Yes," she admitted, her expression turning serious. "When the rain comes, it reminds me of all the days I spent waiting. I wanted to see if someone would notice me, just like you did. It was never meant to be scary. I just wanted to connect with someone again." The realization washed over me. The doll's movements, the feeling of it creeping closer to my bed, were cries for help rather than malice. My heart ached for the little girl who had once cherished that doll, trapped in a cycle of isolation and longing. "Can you stay here? In this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret shook her head gently. "I can't. I am bound to the attic, and this is a momentary escape. But you have the power to keep our connection alive. Whenever you feel lonely or scared, think of me, and I'll be there." Tears brimmed in my eyes as I realized how profound this moment was. I had unknowingly become her confidant, her friend, and now she was entrusting me with her story. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, and the emptiness that had lingered inside me for so long began to fade. "I will remember you, Margaret," I promised, my voice trembling. "You'll never be alone again." With a warm smile, she took a step back, and the meadow began to dissolve around us, the vibrant colors fading into a soft gray. I felt the world shift, the attic reappearing, and I found myself sitting on the floor with the doll still cradled in my arms. I looked around, half expecting to see Margaret standing next to me, but she was gone. Yet the air felt different, lighter, somehow. I could still sense her presence, a lingering warmth that filled the space. I could hardly believe what had just happened, but I knew I would never forget her. From that night on, the doll remained in my room, a cherished possession rather than a source of fear. I often spoke to it, sharing my thoughts and dreams as if Margaret were still there listening. And as the rain continued to fall outside, I found comfort in knowing that I had made a connection that transcended the bounds of life and death. Days turned into weeks, and soon it was time for me to return home. I packed my belongings, the doll carefully nestled among my clothes. I felt a pang of sadness as I took one last look at my grandmother's house, knowing that I would miss the summer days spent in her care. But I also felt a sense of purpose, knowing that I had given Margaret the companionship she had longed for. Last night, I lay in bed with the doll beside me, the rain tapping rhythmically against the window. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to drift into a peaceful slumber. As I slept, I dreamt of the meadow, of Margaret's laughter, and the bond we had forged in the darkness of the attic. But in the early hours of the morning, I awoke to a different sound, soft whispers swirling around my room. I opened my eyes, heart pounding in my chest. The doll was sitting upright, its eyes glinting in the dim light. I sat up, startled. "Margaret," I whispered, fear creeping in. The doll's voice filled the air, soft and melodic. "I'm here, my friend. I'll always be here." Relief washed over me, but confusion lingered. "Why are you talking? I thought you had to stay in the attic." "I am bound to the attic, but my spirit is free when I am with you," the doll replied. "You brought me back to life, and I will always be part of your story." The air around me crackled with energy, and I felt a surge of warmth envelop me. I realized in that moment that this connection was more than just a childhood fantasy. It was a promise of friendship, a bond that would not easily be broken. "I will never forget you, Margaret," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "Nor will I forget you. Keep the magic alive, and I will always be with you," she said, her voice fading into a soft echo. As dawn broke, the rain began to lighten, the clouds slowly parting to reveal a new day. I felt a renewed sense of hope and a commitment to honor the memory of my friend. With the doll safely in my possession, I knew I had a piece of magic that would stay with me forever. As the days passed after my return home, life began to settle back into a familiar routine. Yet, something within me had irrevocably changed. I carried Margaret's spirit with me, and I often found myself speaking to the doll as I navigated through school, friendships, and the small challenges of everyday life. It became my secret comfort, a tangible reminder of the magic that existed in the world, even in the most ordinary moments. One evening, while studying in my room, I glanced over at the doll perched on my desk, its porcelain features glowing softly in the lamplight. I felt compelled to share everything that had happened since the summer. The loneliness I once felt, the adventures I had experienced, and the lessons I had learned from Margaret. I poured my heart out, speaking aloud as if she were right there beside me. "I know you're still with me, Margaret," I said, feeling a warmth envelop the room. "I miss our talks. You made me realize how important it is to connect with others. I've been trying to reach out more, to make friends and share stories." In response, the air around me shifted gently, as if she were listening intently. I closed my eyes and envisioned our meadow, the vibrant colors and laughter echoing in my mind. In that moment, I understood that Margaret had given me the gift of connection, not just with her spirit, but with the world around me. That weekend, I decided to host a small gathering with my friends. It was a chance to share stories and laughter, just like I had with Margaret. I carefully placed the doll in the center of the room, its presence a tribute to the friendship that had taught me so much. As my friends arrived, I felt a surge of nervous energy. Would they think it was silly? Would they understand its significance? "Is that a creepy doll?" one of my friends jokes, eyeing it with curiosity. "It's not just any doll," I said, smiling. "It has a story, and I want to share it with all of you." I took a deep breath and began to recount my summer experience, from the discovery in the attic to the lessons Margaret had imparted. My friends listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to intrigue. "You really found a way to connect with it?" another friend asked, leaning in. "That's kind of amazing." By the end of the night, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Sharing my story had not only bonded us as friends, but also sparked a sense of wonder in the room. We discussed our childhoods, our fears, and the things we cherished most. The conversations flowed easily, and I was reminded that there was magic in vulnerability, something I had once feared but was now learning to embrace. As the evening wound down and my friends began to leave, I noticed that the doll seemed to shine more brightly, a soft glow illuminating its features. It was as if Margaret was celebrating with us, proud that I had taken the lessons learned in the attic and transformed them into something beautiful. In the following weeks, I continued to reach out to others, creating deeper connections and fostering friendships. I often looked to the doll for inspiration, reminding myself of the importance of companionship. It became a symbol of everything I had gained, not just from my encounter with Margaret, but from the willingness to share my life openly with those around me. Then, one rainy afternoon, much like the day I had found the doll, I sat down to reflect. I held the doll close and closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me. Suddenly, I felt a gentle warmth envelop me again, like a comforting embrace. "Margaret," I whispered, half expecting her voice to echo in the silence. "Thank you for keeping the magic alive," a soft voice answered, echoing faintly in my mind. "You've shared my story, and now you have created new ones. Remember, I will always be with you, in every friend you make and every story you share." Tears welled up in my eyes as I absorbed the weight of her words. I understood then that the bond we had forged was not a burden, but a blessing. I no longer felt the weight of fear associated with the doll. Instead, it became a cherished reminder of the power of connection, the importance of community, and the beauty of friendship. As the rain began to tap against the windows, I smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I had learned that life could be both magical and terrifying, but it was the connections we made with others that gave us strength. I placed the doll back on the shelf, where it would continue to watch over me and inspire me to cherish the moments spent with loved ones. From that day forward, I never took those connections for granted. I celebrated the friendships I formed, shared my stories, and kept the spirit of Margaret alive in my heart. And even as I grew older and life changed around me, I knew that as long as I remembered her, the magic of our bond would never fade. If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you'll want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.